episode 159.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, now, from deep in the darkest forests of northern Minnesota, the show you've waited for. This is Grizzly's Growl. And I am honored to present our host, the man, the mystery, the legend. This is Grizzly.
Hello again and welcome back. This is David Grizzly Smith, a.k.a. Grizzly Silversmith, sometimes on Second Life. Hello again. Doing the brief chat segment prior to doing yet another episode of The Everlasting Man, which will be up shortly. A couple of things I wanted to let you know about. Let's see. First of all, I finally managed to get back my primary website for the podcast, primary domain name for the podcast. For a long time, I did have grizzliesgrowls.com, and I ended up losing that because I ran out of money. And then some domain squatter got a hold of it, and I couldn't get it back. And then recently, I was on Google Domains site, and I noted that it was available again. The folks who had snatched it up when I dropped it and were trying to convince me to give them thousands of dollars for it, finally gave it up. Finally stepped back, and I jumped on that son of a gun. So now I have grizzliesgrowls.com back again. I registered it on Google Domains for the next 5 years. So about 2021, something like that, is when I have to renew again. So there's that. That's done. That's going to be me for the foreseeable future. grizzliesgrowls.com, just so you know. And some of you who are new to the podcast didn't even know about that domain. There is once again an email address of grizzly@grizzliesgrowls.com in case you're ever interested in sending an email comment. You could do that. I'm just saying. And I'm in the process of moving Podbusker over to Google Domains, and my old DigitalVoyageur URL is also going to be on Google Domains. And then we'll figure out what the heck to do with them. I'm thinking I might just point Podbusker at the blog and have Grizzly's Growls as just the podcast, except I hate to lose that for email. That's the thing. So, because that's the thing, you can set it up so it points right, and that looks as if that is the URL for the podcast, for the Libsyn site. But unfortunately, when you do that, it decides the domain name servers, the DNS servers for that Libsyn uses, don't give you the option of using that domain for anything else. It just says, okay, this points to this website, period, full stop. Email, forget about it. Anything else, forget about it. Just this website, which would be lovely if I didn't want to also be able to get email at grizzliesgrowls.com. So, I may not do that. But on the other hand, the blog side, Podbusker, I'm not really using it for much of anything else. So I might just as well point that to just the blog and make it the Podbusker blog. So, and those two, what would you call those domains? Grizzly's Growls is more or less the function, or the content domain, if you will, because that's got the blogs behind it. Podbusker and Digital Voyageur are more like job description domains, if you will. Podbusker, well, basically, if you know what a busker is, basically picture the guy out on the sidewalk strumming a guitar, possibly singing with the guitar case open, hoping somebody wandering by will drop in a buck or two. Yeah. That's a busker. Basically someone who was doing a kind of performance and hoping that somebody's going to give them a little bit of money, but not necessarily expecting it. And that's pretty much what that term means. A podcaster who is a busker, a podbusker, if you will. Now, the other thing, the source of DigitalVoyageur, and I think I mentioned this in past podcasts, of course. DigitalVoyageur refers to back in the day. This is a few years back now, I guess. It's been a while. There was a period when the folks who considered such things decided, and mostly PR people and in particular marketing folks, decided, and it's mostly a marketing thing, to describe the difference between the younger people and us old folks as digital natives and digital immigrants. Okay, the idea is that the kids, of course, are born surrounded by the digital world that we live in now, and us old folks came into it late. You know, we basically showed up, and here's all this digital stuff, and we have no clue what we're doing with any of it. And the digital natives, of course, are just naturally smarter at it than we are. Or at least that was the initial presentation thereof. Again, probably for marketing purposes, basically pat them on the back and, flatter them so that they'll buy stuff. But a little silly to assume that the young people know everything there is to know about about the internet, about the online world, about computers, about the whole deal. Because there are different things to know. I mean, there are things that you know about driving a car because you drive one, right? But there are other things that you know about cars if you ever had to build one. And if you were around when they were building the first cars and you saw the whole progression of how cars came to be, there are things you know about cars that somebody who has just driven a modern car wouldn't necessarily know. The same thing with computers, I think. There are things, there's a different culture for, as it were, the digital natives. They do interact differently, on a usual basis. They expect to interact differently. They expect to have those interaction tools, of a particular type available. They expect that. We don't expect that, particularly. We expect to, we have gotten used to having those things available, but we don't, we have to stop for just a beat and think about it, I guess, is the way to put it. Anyway, so digital natives and digital immigrants. I was thinking about those terms in particular, whether or not there's a superiority of skills in the hands of the digital natives. And I was thinking, well, if you're going to use that as a metaphor for the European invasion of the New World, if you're going to use that for your consideration of the digital world, not just the internet, but I mean everything, the whole history of computing, then you really do have to have some more categories than that. Because there weren't just natives, people that were born here, like, and we're not talking about Native Americans, talking about like Virginia Dare, okay, born here in the pioneering days of the New World, for us white folks, and didn't know anything else. She just got born here, and this was the way that things were out in the wild, wild East, where she was born, and didn't know anything different, really. She read about it maybe in books, if they had books, but didn't really know a lot of anything else other than what she grew up with. And then you had the digital immigrants. The American immigrants basically came over from Europe with the expectations from there and came here, and things were very different indeed. Okay. So there's that. I'll give them that. But if you're going to consider those correlations, those similarities, you also have to consider some other folks in the digital world. For example, what about the digital pioneers? Can you treat them as, oh, well, they're digital immigrants, though they don't know as much? It's like, excuse me, the people that built the internet, conceived the internet in the first place, they know less than the children using the phones to sext each other. Yeah, not so much, no. yeah, so you really have to consider the digital pioneers. I won't try to list them here, but you Google them. I guess you could do that. So there's that. There are the digital, the explorers, the trailblazers, people that not just discovered the New World and discovered the parts of the New World that nobody had been to yet, but also discovered and cleared the way for people to follow on, created the paths that people follow. You can't exclude the trailblazers, the digital trailblazers, another category. I am not, and I don't think I ever will be or ever would be considered a digital pioneer. I didn't invent any of this stuff. And I'm not a digital trailblazer. I didn't really create the ways that people use to get about or get to the world we have now. I didn't do any of that. But I feel, I see my history with the digital world as that term that I used for that domain, DigitalVoyageur. The Voyageurs, and if you were from northern Minnesota, you might well be more as familiar with it. The Voyageurs were not people who were clearing trails for other people to easily come down. Many of them didn't even want that. They were not people who were discovering new places. That wasn't their goal. They might well discover places that white people hadn't been before, but they didn't. That wasn't what they were shooting for. The Voyageurs were out in the jungle, in the wilds, to make a living. And it was a rough living they made. And they spent an awful lot of time on their own, wandering, not bathing for long periods of time, and dealing with the wild and crazy aspects of the New World, if you will. And the original, really, for digital voyageurs, it was the same thing. Spending a lot of time on your own and not bathing a lot. Basically finding ways, even when things were tremendously primitive back in the old days when I was a boy, finding ways to make a living. Being that guy that knew how the computers worked, or that girl, That was a very different life on its own way. Now, of course, a lot of the stuff, and I know how to do some of the new stuff, but it's a lot easier now, And when we were doing it back in the day, it wasn't easy. It was extremely hard and complicated stuff, and a lot of it I never honestly understood, but I understood enough of it to be able to make a living doing it. And similarly to the voyageurs who were out there in the woods hunting and trapping and whatnot, and living in cabins on bacon and not bathing a lot. He basically didn't have knowledge of absolutely everything about the woods they lived in. They didn't know everything about the animals they were capturing, but they knew enough about them to be able to catch them and skin them and sell the furs and the hides and whatnot. And like I say, I was never a great expert on computers. I knew a bit about them. I was relative to your average bear, as you will, more knowledgeable than a lot of people. But I was never a brilliant expert on computers, although I could do a creditable impression of one to people who didn't know any better. And that was a kind of a special group we were, I think. And there were a number of other people who can certainly jump up and say, yeah, that's pretty much where I was at too. I had a job being the person who knew how to run the computer and so on. And so that's what Digital Voyageur, why I have that domain name registered. DigitalVoyageur.com for the people that didn't invent it and didn't explore it and didn't clear a path for anybody else to use it, but did manage to figure out how to make a living, even when it was incredibly primitive and awfully hard to work with. I don't know what I'm going to do with that domain. I think it's kind of a cool domain name, but I have no idea what the heck to do with it. Would make an interesting podcast, I suppose, for somebody to do. Not something I'm right now not interested in doing that one anyway. Anyway, so Grizzly's Growls is mine again. Podbusker's getting moved over. A Digital Voyageur is getting moved over. Grizzly's Growls email addresses are back. GrizzliesGrowls.com email addresses are back. And what else is going on? Oh, you may have noticed a little bit of an audio difference in the current podcast. That's because got my federal tax refund back, and it decided to upgrade the audio hardware just a tad here at the cave. I have been using my Samson Zoom H2 handy recorder for many years as a USB microphone to record my podcast with, and it did a bang-up job. It's been wonderful. It has been very, very remarkably durable. But I happen to have enough money, and I got myself a Blue Yeti microphone. It's a USB microphone, and it's specifically for that. It's not a recorder. The H2 is a recorder that you can use as a USB microphone. This is intended for that, and it's intended to have very good audio quality. You'll have to tell me if you think it does. It looks to me like it does, and it sounds to me like it does, but I hope you're pleased and or satisfied with the quality, and we'll see what we think. But so far, I've been pretty pleased with it, and I think it makes more sense to have something that's going to be a USB microphone, intended to be a USB microphone, to use that way. Anything else that's new? Not that I can think of off the top of my head. There may be other things coming. I've got some odds and ends of audio files, some sound effects and whatnot. I've got an order, so I'm going to be getting those. I'll be able to use those for some things, anyway, some projects. And we'll see how things change there. Anyway, I'm going to, let's see, what's the last one I did? I did part 1, chapter 4. So I guess the next thing up will be Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, part 1, chapter 5 it would be. So when I get that recorded, I hope you enjoy it. And good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are. The Everlasting Man by Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Read by David Grizzly Smith. Part 1. On the Creature Called Man. Chapter 5. Man and Mythologies. What are here called the gods might almost alternatively be called the daydreams. To compare them to dreams is not to deny that dreams can come true. To compare them to travelers' tales is not to deny that they may be true tales, or at least truthful tales. In truth, they are the sort of tales the traveler tells to himself. All this mythological business belongs to the poetical part of man. It seems strangely forgotten nowadays that a myth is a work of imagination, and therefore a work of art. It needs a poet to make it. It needs a poet to criticize it. There are more poets than non-poets in the world, as is proved by the popular origin of such legends. But for some reason I have never heard explained, it is only the minority of unpoetical people who are allowed to write critical studies of these popular poems. We do not submit a sonnet to a mathematician or a song to a calculating boy, but we do indulge the equally fantastic idea that folklore can be treated as a science. Unless these things are appreciated artistically, they are not appreciated at all. When the professor is told by the Polynesian that once there was nothing except a great feathered serpent, unless the learned man feels a thrill and a half-temptation to wish it were true, he is no judge of such things at all. When he is assured on the best Red Indian authority that a primitive hero carried the sun and moon and stars in a box, unless he clasps his hands and almost kicks his legs as a child would at such a charming fancy. He knows nothing about the matter. This test is not nonsensical. Primitive children and barbaric children do laugh and kick like other children, and we must have a certain simplicity to repicture the childhood of the world. When Hiawatha was told by his nurse that a warrior threw his grandmother up to the moon, he laughed like any English child told by his nurse that a cow jumped over the moon. The child sees the joke, as well as most men, and better than some scientific men. But the ultimate test, even of the fantastic, is the appropriateness of the inappropriate. And the test must appear merely arbitrary, because it is merely artistic. If any student tells me that the infant Hiawatha only laughed out of respect for tribal custom of sacrificing the aged to economical housekeeping, I say he did not. If any scholar tells me that the cow jumped over the moon only because a heifer was sacrificed to Diana, I answer that it did not. It happened because it is obviously the right thing for a cow to jump over the moon. Mythology is a lost art, one of the few arts that really are lost, but it is an art. The horned moon and the horned moon calf make a harmonious and almost quiet pattern. And throwing your grandmother into the sky is not good behavior, but it is perfectly good taste. Thus, scientists seldom understand, as artists understand, that one branch of the beautiful is the ugly. They seldom allow for the legitimate liberty of the grotesque, and they will dismiss a savage myth as merely coarse and clumsy and an evidence of degradation because it has not all the beauty of the herald Mercury new lighted on a heaven-kissing hill, when it really has the beauty of the Mock Turtle or the Mad Hatter. It is the supreme proof of a man being prosaic that he always insists on poetry being poetical. Sometimes the humor is in the very subject as well as the style of the fable. The Australian Aborigines, regarded as the rudest of savages, have a story about a giant frog who had swallowed the sea and all the waters of the world, and who was only forced to spill them by being made to laugh. All the animals, with all their antics, passed before him, and like Queen Victoria he was not amused. He collapsed at last before an eel, who stood delicately balanced on the tip of its tail, doubtless with a rather desperate dignity. Any amount of fine fantastic literature might be made out of that fable. There is philosophy in that vision of the dry world before the beatific deluge of laughter. There is imagination in the mountainous monster erupting like an aqueous volcano. There is plenty of fun in the thought of his goggling visage as the pelican or the penguin passed by. Anyhow, the frog laughed, but the folklore student remains grave. Moreover, even where the fables are inferior as art, they cannot be properly judged by science, still less properly judged as science. Some myths are very crude and queer, like the early drawings of children, but the child is trying to draw. It is none the less an error to treat his drawing as if it were a diagram or intended to be a diagram. The student cannot make a scientific statement about the savage because the savage is not making a scientific statement about the world. He is saying something quite different, what might be called the gossip of the gods. We may say, if we like, that it is believed before there is time to examine it. It would be true to say it is accepted before there is time to believe it. I confess I doubt the whole theory of the dissemination of myths, or, as it commonly is, of one myth. It is true that something in our nature and conditions makes many stories similar, but each of them may be original. One man does not borrow the story from the other man, though he may tell it from the same motive as the other man. It would be easy to apply the whole argument about legend to literature and turn it into a vulgar monomania of plagiarism. I would undertake to trace a notion like that of the golden bough through individual modern novels as easily as through communal and antiquated myths. I would undertake to find something like a bunch of flowers figuring again and again from the fatal bouquet of Becky Sharp to the spray of roses sent by the Princess of Ruritania. But though these flowers may spring from the same soil, it is not the same faded flower that is flung from hand to hand. Those flowers are always fresh. The true origin of all the myths has been discovered much too often. There are too many keys to mythology, as there are too many cryptograms in Shakespeare. Everything is phallic. Everything is totemistic. Everything is seed time and harvest. Everything is ghosts and grave offerings. Everything is the golden bough of sacrifice. Everything is the sun and moon. Everything is everything. Every folklore student who know a little more than his own monomania, every man of wider reading and critical culture like Andrew Lang, has practically confessed that the bewilderment of these things left his brain spinning. Yet the whole trouble comes from a man trying to look at these stories from the outside, as if they were scientific objects. He has only to look at them from the inside and ask himself how he would begin a story. A story may start with anything and go anywhere. It may start with a bird without the bird being a totem. It may start with the sun without being a solar myth. It is said that there are only 10 plots in the world, and there will certainly be common and recurrent elements. Set 10,000 children talking at once and telling taradiddles about what they did in the wood, and it will not be hard to find parallels suggesting sun worship or animal worship. Some of the stories may be pretty, and some silly, and some perhaps dirty, but they can only be judged as stories. In the modern dialect, they can only be judged aesthetically. It is strange that aesthetics, or mere feeling, which is now allowed to usurp where it has no rights at all, to wreck reason with pragmatism and morals with anarchy, is apparently not allowed to give a purely aesthetic judgment on what is obviously a purely aesthetic question. We may be fanciful about everything, except fairy tales. Now, the first fact is that the most simple people have the most subtle ideas. Everybody ought to know that, for everybody has been a child. Ignorant as a child is, he knows more than he can say, and feels not only atmospheres, but fine shades. And in this matter there are several fine shades. Nobody understands it who has not had what can only be called the ache of the artist to find some sense and some story in the beautiful things he sees. His hunger for secrets and his anger at any tower or tree escaping with its tale untold. He feels that nothing is perfect unless it is personal. Without that, the blind, unconscious beauty of the world stands in its garden like a headless statue. One need only be a very minor poet to have wrestled with the tower or the tree until it spoke like a Titan or a Dryad. It is often said that pagan mythology was a personification of the powers of nature. The phrase is true, in a sense, but it is very unsatisfactory, because it implies that the forces are abstractions, and the personification is artificial. Myths are not allegories. Natural powers are not, in this case, abstractions. It is not as if there were a god of gravitation. There may be a genius of the waterfall, but not of mere falling, even less than of mere water. The impersonation is not of something impersonal. The point is that the personality perfects the water with significance. Father Christmas is not an allegory of snow and holly. He is not merely the stuff called snow afterwards artificially given a human form like a snowman. He is something that gives a new meaning to the white world and the evergreens, so that snow itself seems to be warm rather than cold. The test, therefore, is purely imaginative. But imaginative does not mean imaginary. It does not follow that it is all what the moderns call subjective, when they mean false. Every true artist does feel, consciously or unconsciously, that he is touching transcendental truths, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. In other words, the natural mystic does know that there is something there, something behind the clouds or within the trees. But he believes that the pursuit of beauty is the way to find it, that imagination is a sort of incantation that can call it up. Now, we do not comprehend this process in ourselves, far less in our most remote fellow creatures, and the danger of these things being classified is that they may seem to be comprehended. A really fine work of folklore, like the Golden Bough, will leave too many readers with the idea, for instance, that this or that story of a giant's or wizard's heart in a casket or a cave only means some stupid and static superstition called the external soul. But we do not know what these things mean, simply because we do not know what we ourselves mean when we are moved by them. Suppose somebody in a story says, "Pluck this flower and a princess will die in a castle beyond the sea." We do not know why. Something stirs in the subconscious, or why what is impossible seems almost inevitable. Suppose we read, "And in the hour when the king extinguished the candle, his ships were wrecked far away on the coast of Hebrides." We do not know why the imagination has accepted that image before the reason can reject it, or why such correspondences seem really to correspond to something in the soul. Very deep things in our nature, some dim sense of the dependence of great things upon small, some dark suggestion that the things nearest to us stretch far beyond our power, some sacramental feeling of the magic in material substances, and many more emotions past fading out are in an idea like that of the external soul. The power, even in the myths of savages, is like the power in the metaphors of poets. The soul of such a metaphor is often very emphatically an external soul. The best critics have remarked that in the best poets, the simile is often a picture that seems quite separate from the text. It is as irrelevant as the remote castle to the flower or the Hebridean coast to the candle. Shelley compares the skylark to a young woman on a turret, to a rose embedded in thick foliage, to a series of things that seem to be about as unlike as a skylark in the sky as anything we can imagine. I suppose the most potent piece of pure magic in English literature is the much-quoted passage in Keats' Nightingale about the casements opening on the perilous foam. And nobody notices that the image seems to come from nowhere, that it appears abruptly, after some almost equally irrelevant remarks about Ruth, and that it has nothing in the world to do with the subject of the poem. If there is one place in the world where nobody could reasonably expect to find a nightingale, it is on a windowsill at the seaside. But it is only in the same sense that nobody would expect to find a giant's heart in a casket under the sea. Now, it would be very dangerous to classify the metaphors of the poets. When Shelley says that the cloud will rise like a child from the womb, like a ghost from the tomb, it would be quite possible to call the first a case of the coarse primitive birth myth, and the second a survival of the ghost worship which became ancestor worship. But it is the wrong way of dealing with a cloud, and is liable to leave the learned in the condition of Polonius, only too ready to think it like a weasel, or very like a whale. Two facts must follow from this psychology of daydreams, which must be kept in mind throughout their development in mythologies and even religions. First, these imaginative impressions are often strictly local. So far from being abstractions turned into allegories, they are often images almost concentrated into idols. The poet feels the mystery of a particular forest, not of the science of afforestation or the department of woods and forests. He worships the peak of a particular mountain, not the abstract idea of altitude. So, we find the god is not merely water, but often one special river. He may be the sea because the sea is single, like a stream. The river that runs round the world. Ultimately, doubtless, many deities are enlarged into elements, but they are something more than omnipresent. Apollo does not merely dwell wherever the sun shines. His home is on the rock of Delphi. Diana is great enough to be in three places at once, earth and heaven and hell, but greater is Diana of the Ephesians. This localized feeling has its lowest form in the mere fetish or talisman, such as millionaires put on their motor cars, but it can also harden into something like a high and serious religion, where it is connected with high and serious duties, into the gods of the city or even the gods of the hearth. The second consequence is this, that in these pagan cults there is every shade of sincerity and insincerity. In what sense exactly did an Athenian really think he had to sacrifice to Pallas Athena? What scholar is really certain of the answer? In what sense did Dr. Johnson really think that he had to touch all the posts in the street, or that he had to collect orange peel? In what sense does a child really think that he ought to step on every alternate paving stone? Two things are at least fairly clear. First, in simpler and less self-conscious times, these forms could become more solid without really becoming more serious. Daydreams could be acted in broad daylight, with more liberty of artistic expression, but still, perhaps, with something of the light step of the somnambulist. Wrap Dr. Johnson in an antique mantle, crown him, by his kind permission, with a garland, and he will move in state under those ancient skies of morning, touching a series of sacred posts carved with the heads of strange terminal gods that stand at the limits of the land and of the life of man. Make the child free of the marbles and mosaics of some classic temples to play on a whole floor inlaid with squares of black and white, and he will willingly make this fulfillment of his idle and drifting daydream the clear field for a grave and graceful dance. But the posts and the paving stones are little more and little less real than they are under modern limits. They are not really much more serious for being taken seriously. They have the sort of sincerity that they always had. The sincerity of art is a symbol that expresses very real spiritualities under the surface of life. But they are only sincere in the same sense as art, not sincere in the same sense as morality. The eccentric's collection of orange peel may turn to oranges in a Mediterranean festival or to golden apples in a Mediterranean myth, but they are never on the same plane with the difference between giving the orange to a blind beggar and carefully placing the orange peel so that the beggar may fall and break his leg. Between these two things, there is a difference of kind and not of degree. The child does not think it wrong to step on the paving stone as he thinks it wrong to step on the dog's tail, and it is very certain that whatever jest or sentiment or fancy first set Johnson touching the wooden posts, He never touched wood with any of the feeling with which he stretched out his hands to the timber of that terrible tree, which was the death of God and the life of man. As already noted, this does not mean that there was no reality or even no religious sentiment in such a mood. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church has taken over with uproarious success the whole of this popular business of giving people local legends and lighter ceremonial movements. Insofar as all this sort of paganism was innocent and in touch with nature, there is no reason why it should not be patronized by patron saints as much as by pagan gods. And in any case, there are degrees of seriousness in the most natural make-believe. There is all the difference between fancying there are fairies in the wood, which often only means fancying a certain wood as fit for fairies, and really frightening ourselves until we walk a mile rather than pass a house we have told ourselves is haunted. Behind all these things is the fact that beauty and terror are very real things and related to a real spiritual world, and to touch them at all, even in doubt or fancy, is to stir the deep things of the soul. We all understand that, and the pagans understood it. The point is that paganism did not really stir the soul, except with these doubts and fancies, with the consequence that we today can have little beyond doubts and fancies about paganism. All the best critics agree that all the greatest poets, in pagan Hellas, for example, had an attitude towards their gods which is quite queer and puzzling to men in the Christian era. There seems to be an admitted conflict between the god and the man, but everybody seems to be doubtful about which is the hero and which is the villain. This does not merely apply to a doubter like Euripides in the Bacchae. It applies to a moderate conservative like Sophocles in the Antigone, or even to a regular Tory and reactionary like Aristophanes in the Frogs. Sometimes it would seem that the Greeks believed above all things in reverence, only they had nobody to revere. But the point of the puzzle is this, that all this vagueness and variation arise from the fact that the whole thing began in fancy and in dreaming, and that there are no rules of architecture for a castle in the clouds. This is the mighty and branching tree called mythology, which ramifies round the whole world, whose remote branches under separate skies bear like colored birds the costly idols of Asia, and the half-baked fetishes of Africa, and the fairy kings and princesses of the folk tales of the forest, and buried amid vines and olives the lairs of the Latins, and carried on the clouds of Olympus the buoyant supremacy of the gods of Greece. These are the myths, and he who has no sympathy with myths has no sympathy with men. But he who has most sympathy with myths will most fully realize that they are not, and never were, a religion, in the sense that Christianity or even Islam is a religion. They satisfy some of the needs satisfied by a religion, and notably the need for doing certain things at certain dates, the need of the twin ideas of festivity and formality. But though they provide a man with a calendar, they do not provide him with a creed. A man did not stand up and say, I believe in Jupiter and Juno and Neptune, etc., as he stands up and says, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, and the rest of the Apostles' Creed. Many believed in some, and not in others, or more in some and less in others, or only in a very vague poetical sense in any. There was no moment when they were all collected into an orthodox order which men would fight and be tortured to keep intact. Still less did anybody ever say in that fashion, I believe in Odin and Thor and Freya, for outside Olympus even the Olympian order grows cloudy and chaotic. It seems clear to me that Thor was not a god at all, but a hero. Nothing resembling a religion would picture anybody resembling a god as groping like a pygmy in a great cavern that turned out to be the glove of a giant. That is the glorious ignorance called adventure. Thor may have been a great adventurer, but to call him a god is trying to compare Jehovah with Jack and the Beanstalk. Odin seems to have been a real barbarian chief, possibly of the Dark Ages after Christianity. Polytheism fades away at its fringes into fairy tales or barbaric memories. It is not a thing like monotheism as held by serious monotheists. Again, it does satisfy the need to cry out on some uplifted name or some noble memory in moments that are themselves noble and uplifted, such as the birth of a child or the saving of a city. But the name was so used by many to whom it was only a name. Finally, it did satisfy, or rather partially satisfied, a thing very deep in humanity indeed, the idea of surrendering something as the portion of the unknown powers, of pouring wine upon the ground, of throwing a ring into the sea, in a word, of sacrifice. It is the wise and worthy idea of not taking our advantage to the full, of putting something in the other balance to ballast our dubious pride, of paying tithes to nature for our land. This deep truth of the danger of insolence or being too big for our boots runs through all the great Greek tragedies and makes them seem great. But it runs side by side with an almost cryptic agnosticism about the real nature of the gods to be propitiated. Where that gesture of surrender is most magnificent, as among the great Greeks, there is really much more the idea that the man will be better for losing the ox than that the god will be better for getting it. It is said that in its grosser forms there are often actions grotesquely suggestive of the god really eating the sacrifice. But this fact is falsified by the error that I put first in this note on mythology. It is misunderstanding the psychology of daydreams. A child pretending there is a goblin in a hollow tree will do a crude and material thing like leaving a piece of cake for him. A poet might do a more dignified and elegant thing like bringing to the god fruits as well as flowers. But the degree of seriousness in both acts may be the same, or it may vary in almost any degree. The crude fancy is no more a creed than the ideal fancy is a creed. Certainly, the pagan does not disbelieve, like an atheist, any more than he believes, like a Christian. He feels the presence of powers about which he guesses and invents. St. Paul said that the Greeks had one altar to an unknown god, but in truth, all their gods were unknown gods. And the real break in history did come when St. Paul declared to them whom they had ignorantly worshipped. The substance of all such paganism may be summarized thus. It is an attempt to reach the divine reality through the imagination alone. In its own field, reason does not restrain it at all. It is vital to view of all history that reason is something separate from religion, even in the most rational of these civilizations. It is only as an afterthought, when such cults are decadent or on the defensive, that a few Neoplatonists or even a few Brahmins are found trying to rationalize them, and even then only by trying to allegorize them. But in reality, the rivers of mythology and philosophy run parallel and do not mingle till they meet in the sea of Christendom. Simple secularists still talk as if the Church had introduced a sort of schism between reason and religion. The truth is that the Church was actually the first thing that ever tried to combine reason and religion. There had never before been any such union of the priests and the philosophers. Mythology, then, sought God through the imagination, or sought truth by means of beauty, in the sense in which beauty includes much of the most grotesque ugliness. But the imagination has its own laws, and therefore its own triumphs, which neither logicians nor men of science can understand. It remained true to that imaginative instinct through 1,000 extravagances, through every crude cosmic pantomime of a pig eating the moon or the world being cut out of a cow, through all the dizzy convolutions and mystic malformations of Asiatic art, through all the stark and staring rigidity of Egyptian and Assyrian portraiture, through every kind of cracked mirror of mad art that seemed to deform the world and displace the sky, it remained true to something about which there can be no argument, something that makes it possible for some artist of some school to stand suddenly still before that particular deformity and say, "My dream has come true." Therefore, do we all, in fact, feel that pagan or primitive myths are infinitely suggestive, so long as we are wise enough not to inquire what they suggest. Therefore, we all feel what is meant by Prometheus stealing fire from heaven, until some prig of a pessimist or progressive person explains what it means. Therefore, we all know the meaning of Jack and the Beanstalk, until we're told. In this sense, it is true, it is the ignorant who accept myths, but only because it is the ignorant who appreciate poems. Imagination has its own laws and triumphs, and a tremendous power began to clothe its images, whether images in the mind or in the mud, whether the bamboo of South Sea Islands or the marble of the mountains of Hellas. But there was always a trouble in the triumph, which in these pages I have tried to analyze in vain, and perhaps I might in conclusion state it thus. The crux and crisis is that man found it natural to worship, even natural to worship unnatural things. The posture of the idol might be stiff and strange, but the gesture of the worshipper was generous and beautiful. He not only felt freer when he bent, he actually felt taller when he bowed. Henceforth, anything that took away the gesture of worship would stunt and even maim him forever. Henceforth, being merely secular would be a servitude and an inhibition. If a man cannot pray, he is gagged. If he cannot kneel, he is in irons. We therefore feel, throughout the whole of paganism, a curious double feeling of trust and distrust. When the man makes the gesture of salutation and of sacrifice, when he pours out the libation or lifts up the sword, he knows he is doing a worthy and virile thing. He knows he is doing one of the things for which a man was made. His imaginative experiment is therefore justified. But precisely because it began with imagination, there is, to the end, something of mockery in it, and especially in the object of it. This mockery, in the more intense moments of the intellect, becomes the almost intolerable irony of Greek tragedy. There seems a disproportion between the priest and the altar, or between the altar and the god. The priest seems more solemn and almost more sacred than the god. All the order of the temple is solid and sane and satisfactory to certain parts of our nature, except the very center of it, which seems strangely mutable and dubious, like a dancing flame. It is the first thought round which the whole has been built, and the first thought is still a fancy and almost a frivolity. In that strange place of meeting, the man seems more statuesque than the statue. He himself can stand forever in the noble and natural attitude of the statue of the praying boy. But whatever name be written on the pedestal, whether Zeus or Ammon or Apollo, the god whom he worships is Proteus. The praying boy may be said to express a need rather than to satisfy a need. It is by a normal and necessary action that his hands are lifted, but it is no less a parable that his hands are empty. About the nature of that need there will be more to say, but at this point it may be said that perhaps after all this true instinct that player and sacrifice are a liberty and an enlargement refers back to that vast and half-forgotten conception of universal fatherhood, which we have already seen everywhere fading from the morning sky. This is true, and yet it is not all the truth. There remains an indestructible instinct in the poet, as represented by the pagan, that he is not entirely wrong in localizing as God. It is something in the soul of poetry, if not of piety. And the greatest of poets, when he defined the poet, did not say that he gave us the universe or the absolute or the infinite, but in his own larger language a local habitation and a name. No poet is merely a pantheist. Those who are counted most pantheistic, like Shelley, start with some local and particular image, as the pagans did. After all, Shelley wrote of the skylark because it was a skylark. You could not issue an imperial or international translation of it for use in South America, in which it was changed to an ostrich. So the mythological imagination moves, as it were, in circles, hovering either to find a place or to return to it. In a word, mythology is a search. It is something that combines a recurrent desire with a recurrent doubt, mixing a most hungry sincerity in the idea of seeking for a place with a most dark and deep and mysterious levity about all the places found. So far could the lonely imagination lead, and we must turn later to the lonely reason. Nowhere along this road did the two ever travel together. That is where all these things differed from religion, or the reality in which these different dimensions met in a sort of solid. They differed from the reality not in what they looked like, but in what they were. A picture may look like a landscape. It may look in every detail exactly like a landscape. The only detail in which it differs is that it is not a landscape. The difference is only that which divides a portrait of Queen Elizabeth from Queen Elizabeth. Only in this mythical and mystical world the portrait could exist before the person, and the portrait was therefore more vague and doubtful. But anybody who has felt and fed on the atmosphere of these myths will know what I mean when I say that in one sense they did not really profess to be realities. The pagans had dreams about realities, and they would have been the first to admit in their own words that some came through the gate of ivory and others through the gate of horn. The dreams do indeed tend to be very vivid dreams when they touch on those tender or tragic things which can really make a sleeper awaken with the sense that his heart has been broken in his sleep. They tend continually to hover over certain passionate themes of meeting and parting, of a life that ends in death, or a death that is the beginning of life. Demeter wanders over a stricken world looking for a stolen child. Isis stretches out her arms over the earth in a vain to gather the limbs of Osiris. And there is lamentation upon the hills for Attis and through the woods for Adonis. There mingles with all such mourning the mystical and profound sense that death can be a deliverer and an appeasement, that such death gives us a divine blood for a renovating river, and that all good is found in gathering the broken body of the god. We may truly call these foreshadowing, so long as we remember that foreshadowings are shadows. And the metaphor of a shadow happens to hit very exactly the truth that is very vital here. For a shadow is a shape, a thing which reproduces shape, but not texture. These things were something like the real thing, and to say that they were like is to say that they were different. Saying something is like a dog is another way of saying it is not a dog. And it is in this sense of identity that a myth is not a man. Nobody really thought of Isis as a human being. Nobody really thought of Demeter as a historical character. Nobody thought of Adonis as the founder of a church. There was no idea that any one of them had changed the world, but rather that their recurrent death and life bore the sad and beautiful burden of the changelessness of the world. Not one of them was a revolution, save in their sense of the revolution of the sun and moon. Their whole meaning is missed if we do not see that they mean the shadows that we are and the shadows that we pursue. In certain sacrificial and communal aspects, they naturally suggest what sort of a God might satisfy them, but they do not profess to be satisfied. Anyone who says they do is a bad judge of character. Now, those who talk about pagan Christs have less sympathy with paganism than with Christianity. Those who call these cults religions and compare them with the certitude and challenge of the church have much less appreciation than we have of what made heathenism human, or of why classic literature is still something that hangs in the air like a song. It is no very human tenderness for the hungry to prove that hunger is the same as food. It is no very genial understanding of youth to argue that hope destroys the need for happiness, and it is utterly unreal to argue that these images in the mind, admired entirely in the abstract, were even in the same world with a living man and a living polity that were worshipped because they were concrete. We might as well say that the boy playing at robbers is the same as a man in his first day in the trenches, or that boys' first fancies about the not impossible she are the same as the sacrament of marriage. They are fundamentally different, exactly where they are superficially similar. We might almost say they are not the same even when they are the same. They are only different because one is real and the other is not. I do not mean merely that I myself believe that one is true and the other is not. I mean that one was never meant to be true in the same sense as the other. The sense in which it was meant to be true, I've tried to suggest vaguely here, but it is undoubtedly very subtle and almost indescribable. It is so subtle that the students who profess to put it up as a rival to our religion miss the whole meaning and purport of their own study. We know better than the scholars, even those of us who are no scholars, what was in that hollow cry that went forth over the dead Adonis, and why the great mother had a daughter wedded to death. We have entered more deeply than they into the Eleusinian mysteries, and have passed a higher grade, where gate within gate guarded the wisdom of Orpheus. We know the meaning of all the myths. We know the last secret revealed to the perfect initiate, and it is not the voice of a priest or a prophet saying these things are. It is the voice of a dreamer and idealist crying, "Why cannot these things be?" Thank you for listening to The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, read by me, David Grizzly Smith. Theme music for this book is Deliberate Thought by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. This book is released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 3.0 license. That means please make copies, please share this book, but don't change it, don't sell it, and do tell people where you got it. If you like this book, leave a comment on grizzly.libsyn.com. Leave a comment or rating on Audiobooks.com or anywhere else you can. Blog about it, podcast about it, tweet about it, tell everyone. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Grizzly's Growls, the life and times of a minor local celebrity. If you like the show, tell your friends. If you don't like the show, tell your enemies. If this podcast lasts more than 4 hours, see your doctor. Theme music is Hot Swing from Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or at feeds.feedburner.com/grizzliesgrowls. Comment at grizzly.libsyn.com or by voicemail at the comment line 218-234-CALL. That's 218-234-2255. These shows are released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 3.0 license. Your mileage may vary.